Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the August 2024 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of Under a False Flag by Lenin from 1915. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So we recently concluded our multi-part reading of Fascism and Social Revolution, 3rd edition by R.P. Dutt, 1935. Excellent book, not only the best anti-fascist book I've ever read, but also a great jumping-off point for learning about Marxism-Leninism. Now that that's posted on the channel both in a chapter-by-chapter format and also in a two-part complete format, I would have loved to have posted it as just one big file, but there is a 12-hour limit, and it is over 13 hours. I'd like to do a couple of things as quick follow-ups. There's another short piece I want to read called Fascism and Empire by Dutt, which will be up in the next few days, and then also a surprise piece, which is highly relevant to current politics. But also relevant, not just to fascism, but also to a number of other topics related to opportunism. We've been talking about the CPUSA, Browderism, electoralism, is this piece, Under a False Flag by Lenin. So it was around this time that Lenin was writing Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. We haven't done that book on the channel yet. We'll be doing it soon. But Lenin also did a number of shorter pieces like Imperialism and the Split in Socialism, in which he goes over some of the characteristics of the imperialist era. So what is the imperialist era? Well, in a nutshell, Lenin described it as advanced monopoly capitalism. And then it has some other particular characteristics. But if you really wanted to just get it down to the shortest possible description, advanced monopoly capitalism, as distinct from the earlier period of capitalism, when capitalism was overthrowing feudalism and was still historically progressive. Under imperialism, capitalism has reached a point of development where it becomes stagnant and moribund and is basically this huge conglomeration of military-industrial complexes and interlocking boards of directors. And while it is progressive compared to the earlier stage of pre-monopoly capitalism, in order for historical progress to continue, a proletarian revolution must occur and the building of socialism must begin. So again, in other words, this is the late stage capitalism which has run out of developmental road. From this point until the proletarian revolution, it only can try to manage and govern the social decay that it oversees while trying to grub profits as much as possible. And this is where fascism per se starts to enter the picture. As we covered in Fascism and Social Revolution and other pieces, fascism is not merely violent capitalism. It is a consequence of an overdue proletarian revolution, and it only arises in this period, the imperialist period. So back to Under a False Flag, which was written not earlier than February 1915, one of the things that we want to highlight in this attack by Lenin on the social chauvinists, who are, in other words, socialist in name, but basically still clinging to the bourgeoisie and national chauvinist in practice, is that Lenin was making the case that in the imperialist countries, the bourgeoisie could no longer contribute to progressive movements. And we say capitalists in the imperialist countries as distinct from capitalists in the developing countries, where national liberation struggles, for example, were still underway, whereas in the imperialist countries, the national liberation struggles were already complete, and the capitalists there were turning from their completed national projects to positioning themselves for the maximum share that they could get out of the emerging world imperialist system, which is where all capitalists end up once the bourgeois nation state is fully formed and capitalist production has reached a sufficiently advanced stage. But we'll discuss it more once we get into the text. First, let's read the front matter. This was first published in 1917 in the first collection of the Proliv publishers, Moscow. Signed N. Konstantinov, published according to the text in the collection. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1974, Moscow, Volume 21. HTML transcription and markup by D. Walters and R. Simbala. And it's in the public domain in the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive, Marxists.org. Thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. Let's begin. Issue number 1 of Nasha Dielo, Petrograd, January 1915, which was a monthly of the Menshevik liquidators and a mouthpiece of social chauvinists in Russia, published a highly characteristic programmatic article by Mr. A. Patrusov, entitled At the Juncture of Two Epochs. Like an earlier magazine article by the same author, the present article sets forth the ideas underlying an entire bourgeois trend of public thought in Russia, the liquidationist, regarding the important and burning problems of the time. Strictly speaking, we have before us not articles, but the manifesto of a definite trend, and anyone who reads them carefully and gives thought to their content will see that only fortuitous considerations, i.e. such that have nothing in common with purely literary interests, have prevented the author's ideas, and those of his friends, since the author does not stand alone, from being expressed in the more appropriate form of a declaration or credo. So just a quick note here on liquidationism. This was a trend within the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party against which Lenin and the Bolsheviks fought. The liquidationists wanted to use only legal tactics of struggle and liquidate the illegal underground arm of the struggle. This was basically a manifestation of revisionist or crypto-bourgeois trends within the vanguard, which previously had taken other forms, including so-called economism in the early 1900s, and as Lenin commented, it basically just kept reincarnating under different movement names. For a long time, the Bolshevik position was to fight liquidationism and to keep the party together. However, eventually, the Bolsheviks did split as conditions changed. Continuing, Patrusov's main idea is that present-day democracy stands at the juncture of two epochs, the fundamental difference between the old epoch and the new, consisting in a transition from national isolation to internationalism. By present-day democracy, Patrusov understands the kind that marked the close of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, as distinct from the old bourgeois democracy that marked the end of the 18th century and the first two-thirds of the 19th. At first glance, it may seem that the author's idea is absolutely correct, that we have before us an opponent to the national liberal tendency predominant in present-day democracy, and that the author is a, quote, internationalist, not a national liberal. Indeed, this defense of internationalism, this reference to national narrow-mindedness and national exclusiveness as features of an outworn and bygone epoch, is it not a breakaway from the wave of national liberalism, that bane of present-day democracy, or rather, of its official representatives? That, at first glance, is not only the possible but the almost inevitable impression, yet it would be a gross error to think so. The author is transporting his cargo under a false flag. Consciously or otherwise, that doesn't matter in this instance, he has resorted to a stratagem by hoisting the flag of internationalism so as the more securely to transport under this flag his contraband cargo of national liberalism. After all, Patrusov is a most undeniable national liberal. The gist of his article, and of his program, platform, and credo, is in the employment of this little, and if you wish, even innocent, stratagem in carrying opportunism under the flag of internationalism. So commenting here, of course, Lenin is trying to say that Patrusov is trying to smuggle in national liberal views while labeling them as internationalism, which they are not. Continuing, one must go into all the details of this maneuver, for the matter is of prime and tremendous importance. Patrusov's use of a false flag is the more dangerous, since he not only cloaks himself with the principle of internationalism, but he also assumes the title of an adherent of, quote, Marxist methodology. In other words, Patrusov pretends to be a true follower and exponent of Marxism, whereas in actual fact, he substitutes national liberalism for Marxism. Patrusov tries to, quote, amend Kautsky, accusing him of, quote, playing the advocate, i.e. of defending liberalism now of one shade, now of another, that is to say, the liberalism of shades peculiar to various nations. Patrusov is out to contrast national liberalism, for it is absolutely indubitable and indisputable that Kautsky has become a national liberal, with internationalism and Marxism. In reality, Patrusov is contrasting parti-colored national liberalism with national liberalism of a single color, whereas Marxism is hostile, and in the present historical situation, absolutely hostile to any kind of national liberalism. We shall now go on to show that such is the case and why. So that's the end of the introduction, and to comment, Kautsky here is Karl Kautsky, an opportunist German socialist leader who at one time was a dedicated and respected Marxist, and then in World War I used his leadership position to completely sell out the working classes of Europe. Lenin wrote a lot about Kautsky, including an entire book, The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky, which is recommendable, and we do have it on the channel. But as for Patrusov, what Lenin is saying is that Patrusov's polemic against Kautsky does not actually contrast national liberalism with internationalism, it contrasts different kinds of national liberalism. So let's continue. Section 1. The highlight of Patrusov's misadventures, which led to his setting out under a national liberal flag, can best be understood if the reader examines the following passage in his article. Quote, "With their characteristic temperament, they," meaning Marx and his comrades, "attacked the problem no matter how difficult it was. They diagnosed the conflict and attempted to determine the success of which side opened up broader vistas for possibilities desirable from their point of view. Thus they laid down a certain basis on which to build their tactics." Unquote. The success of which side is more desirable. This is what has to be determined, and that from an international, not a national, point of view. This is the essence of the Marxist methodology. This is what Kautsky does not do, thus turning from a judge, or a Marxist, into an advocate, a national liberal. Such is Patrusov's line of argument. Patrusov himself is most deeply convinced that he is not playing the advocate when he defends the desirability of success for one side, namely his own, and that conversely, he is guided by truly international considerations with regard to the egregious sins of the other side. Patrusov, Maslov, Plekhanov, etc., who are all guided by truly international considerations, have reached the same conclusions as Patrusov has. This is a simple-mindedness that borders on, well, we shall not make undue haste, but shall first complete an analysis of the purely theoretical question. The success of which side is more desirable was established by Marx in the Italian War of 1859, for instance. Patrusov dwells on this particular instance, which he says, quote, "has a special interest for us because of certain of its features," unquote. We too, for our part, are willing to take the instance chosen by Patrusov. In 1859, Napoleon III declared war on Austria, allegedly for the liberation of Italy, but in reality for his own dynastic aims. Quote, "Behind the back of Napoleon III, says Patrusov, could be discerned the figure of Gorchakov, who had just signed a secret agreement with the Emperor of the French." Unquote. What we have here is a tangle of contradictions. On the one side, the most reactionary European monarchy, which has been oppressing Italy. On the other, the representatives of revolutionary Italy, including Garibaldi, fighting for her liberation, side by side with the ultra-reactionary Napoleon III, etc. Quote, "Would it not have been simpler," Patrusov writes, "to step aside and say that the two are equally bad?" However, neither Engels, Marx, nor Lassalle were attracted by the, quote, "simplicity of such a solution, but started to search the problem," or Patrusov means to say to study and explore the problem, "of the particular outcome of the conflict which might provide the greatest opportunities for a cause dear to all three." Unquote. Lassalle notwithstanding, Marx and Engels came to the conclusion that Prussia must intervene. Among their considerations, as Patrusov himself admits, was that, quote, "of the possibility, as a result of a conflict with the enemy coalition, of a national movement in Germany, which might develop over the heads of its numerous rulers. There was also the consideration as to which power in the concert of Europe was the main evil, the reactionary Danubian monarchy, or other outstanding representatives of this concert. To us, it is not important who was right, Marx or Lassalle," Patrusov concludes. "What is important is that all were agreed on the necessity of determining, from an international point of view, the success of which side was more desirable." Unquote. This is the instance cited by Patrusov, and the way our author pursues the argument. If Marx was then able, quote, "to appraise international conflicts," to use Patrusov's expression, notwithstanding the highly reactionary character of the governments of both belligerent sides, then Marxists, too, are at present obliged to make a similar appraisal, Patrusov concludes. This conclusion is either naive childishness or crass sophistry, since it boils down to the following. Since, in 1859, Marx was working on the problem of the desirability of success for which particular bourgeoisie, we, over half a century later, must solve the problem in exactly the same way. Patrusov has failed to notice that, to Marx in 1859, as well as in a number of later cases, the question of the success of which side is more desirable meant asking the success of which bourgeoisie is more desirable. Patrusov has failed to notice that Marx was working on the problem at a time when there existed indubitably progressive bourgeois movements, which moreover did not merely exist, but were in the forefront of the historical process in the leading states of Europe. Today, it would be ridiculous even to imagine a progressive bourgeoisie, a progressive bourgeois movement in, for instance, such key members of the, quote, concert of Europe as Britain and Germany. The old bourgeois pseudo-democracy of these two key states has turned reactionary. Patrusov has forgotten this and has substituted the standpoint of the old bourgeois so-called democracy for that of present-day non-bourgeois democracy. This shift to the standpoint of another class, and moreover of an old and outmoded class, is sheer opportunism. There cannot be the least doubt that a shift like this cannot be justified by an analysis of the objective content of the historical process in the old and the new epochs. It is the bourgeoisie, for instance in Germany, and in Britain too for that matter, that endeavors to effect the kind of substitution accomplished by Patrusov, viz., replacing of the imperialist epoch by that of bourgeois progressive, national, and democratic movements for liberation. Patrusov is uncritically following in the wake of the bourgeoisie. This is the more unpardonable since, in the instance he has selected, Patrusov has himself been obliged to recognize and specify the considerations guiding Marx, Engels, and Lassalle in those bygone days. There's a footnote from Lenin here. Incidentally, Patrusov refuses to make up his mind as to whether Marx or Lassalle was right in appraising the conditions of the War of 1859. We think that, Mering notwithstanding, Marx was right, whereas Lassalle was then an opportunist, just as he was during his flirtation with Bismarck. Lassalle was adapting himself to the victory of Prussia and Bismarck, to the lack of sufficient strength in the democratic national movements of Italy and Germany. Thus, Lassalle deviated toward a national liberal labor policy, whereas Marx encouraged and developed an independent, consistently democratic policy hostile to national liberal cowardice. Prussia's intervention in 1859 against Napoleon would have stimulated the popular movement in Germany. Lassalle was casting glances not downwards but upwards, as he was fascinated by Bismarck. Bismarck's, quote, success was no justification of Lassalle's opportunism. Back to the main text. First of all, these were considerations on the national movement in Germany and Italy, on the latter's development over the heads of the, quote, representatives of medievalism. Secondly, these were considerations on the, quote, main evil of the reactionary monarchies, the Austrian, the Napoleonic, etc., in the concert of Europe. These considerations are perfectly clear and indisputable. Marxists have never denied the progressiveness of bourgeois national liberation movements against feudal and absolutist forces. Patrusov cannot but know that nothing like this does or can exist in the major, i.e. the leading rival states of today. In those days there existed, both in Italy and in Germany, popular national liberation movements with decades of struggle behind them. In those days the Western bourgeoisie did not give financial support to certain other states. On the contrary, those states were really, quote, the main evil. Patrusov cannot but know, as he admits in the same article, that today none of the other states is or can be the, quote, main evil. The bourgeoisie, in Germany for instance, though not in that country alone, is, for selfish reasons, encouraging the ideology of national movements, attempting to translate that ideology into the epoch of imperialism, i.e., an entirely different epoch. As usual, the opportunists are plodding along in the rear of the bourgeoisie, abandoning the standpoint of present-day democracy and shifting over to that of the old bourgeois democracy. That is the chief shortcoming in all of the articles, as well as in the entire position and the entire line of Patrusov and his liquidationist fellow thinkers. At the time of the old bourgeois democracy, Marx and Engels were working on the problem of the desirability of success for which particular bourgeoisie. They were concerned with a modestly liberal movement developing into a tempestuously democratic one. In the period of present-day, non-bourgeois democracy, Patrusov is preaching bourgeois national liberalism at a time when one cannot even imagine bourgeois progressive movements, whether modestly liberal or tempestuously democratic, in Britain, Germany, or France. Marx and Engels were ahead of their epoch, that of bourgeois national progressive movements. They wanted to give an impetus to such movements so that they might develop over the heads of the representatives of medievalism. Like all social chauvinists, Patrusov is moving backwards, away from his own period, that of present-day democracy, and skipping over to the outworn, dead, and therefore intrinsically false viewpoint of the old bourgeois democracy. That is why Patrusov's following appeal to democracy reveals his muddled thinking and is highly reactionary. Quote, "Do not retreat, but advance, not toward individualism, but towards internationalist consciousness in all its integrity and all its vigor. To advance means, in a certain sense, to go also back to Engels, Marx, and Lassalle, to their method of appraising international conflicts, and to their finding it possible to utilize interstate relations for democratic purposes," unquote. Patrusov drags present-day democracy backwards, not in a certain sense, but in all senses. He drags it back to the slogans and the ideology of the old bourgeois democracy, to the dependence of the masses upon the bourgeoisie. Marx's method consists, first of all, in taking due account of the objective content of a historical process at a given moment, in definite and concrete conditions. This, in order to realize in the first place, the movement of which class is the mainspring of the progress possible in those concrete conditions. In 1859, it was not imperialism that comprised the objective content of the historical process in continental Europe, but national bourgeois movements for liberation. The mainspring was the movement of the bourgeoisie against the feudal and absolutist forces. 55 years later, when the place of the old and reactionary feudal lords has been taken by the not unsimilar finance capital tycoons, the decrepit bourgeoisie, the knowledgeable Patrusov is out to appraise international conflicts from the standpoint of the bourgeoisie, not of the new class. Footnote from Lenin. Indeed, Patrusov writes, it was during that period of seeming stagnation that tremendous molecular processes were taking place in every country. The international situation, too, was gradually changing, the policy of colonial acquisitions, of militant imperialism becoming its determining feature. Unquote. Back to the main text. Patrusov has not given proper thought to the significance of the truth he uttered in the above words. Let us suppose that two countries are at war in the epoch of bourgeois national liberation movements. Which country should we wish success to from the standpoint of present-day democracy? Obviously, to that country whose success will give a greater impetus to the bourgeoisie's liberation movement, make its development more speedy, and undermine feudalism the more decisively. Let us further suppose that the determining feature of the objective historical situation has changed, and that the place of capital striving for national liberation has been taken by international, reactionary, and imperialist finance capital. The former country, let us say, possesses 3/4 of Africa, whereas the latter possesses 1/4. A repartition of Africa is the objective content of their war. To which side should we wish success? It would be absurd to state the problem in its previous form, since we do not possess the old criteria of appraisal. There is neither a bourgeois liberation movement running into decades, nor a long process of the decay of feudalism. It is not the business of present-day democracy either to help the former country to assert its, quote, right to 3/4 of Africa, or to help the latter country, even if it is developing economically more rapidly than the former, to take over those 3/4. So comment here, this is also going to end up in the revolutionary defeatism playlist, which concerns what is the position of the revolutionary proletariat in inter-imperialist conflicts. So the scenario that Lenin just described, where two imperial powers are fighting over the right to divide Africa amongst themselves, and explains why it's not supportable by communists to take either of those sides. This is a lesson a lot of people are having a hard time learning today. For example, taking one side or the other in the emerging NATO versus Russia conflict. Continuing, present-day democracy will remain true to itself only if it joins neither one nor the other imperialist bourgeoisie, only if it says that the two sides are equally bad, and if it wishes the defeat of the imperialist bourgeoisie in every country. Any other decision will, in reality, be national liberal and have nothing in common with genuine internationalism. The reader should not let themselves be deceived by the pretentious terminology Patrusov employs to conceal his switch over to the standpoint of the bourgeoisie. When Patrusov exclaims, quote, not toward individualism, but toward internationalist consciousness in all its integrity and all its vigor, unquote, his aim is to contrast his own point of view with that of Kautsky. He calls the latter's view, and that of others like him, quote, individualism, because of Kautsky's refusal to decide, quote, the success of which side is more desirable, and his justification of the workers' national liberalism in each, quote, individual country. We, on the contrary, he, as it were, says we, Patrusov, Cherevinin, Muslov, Plekhanov, and others, appeal to, quote, internationalist consciousness in all its integrity and all its vigor, unquote, for we stand for national liberalism of a definite shade, in no way from the standpoint of an individual state or an individual nation, but from a standpoint that is genuinely internationalist. This line of reasoning would be ridiculous if it were not so disgraceful. Both Patrusov and company and Kautsky, who have betrayed the standpoint of the class which they are trying hard to represent, are following in the wake of the bourgeoisie. Section 2. Patrusov has entitled his article, At the Juncture of Two Epochs. We are undoubtedly living at the juncture of two epochs, and the historical events that are unfolding before our eyes can be understood only if we analyze in the first place the objective conditions of the transition from one epoch to the other. Here, We have important historical epics. In each of them there are, and will always be, individual and partial movements, now forward, now backward. There are and will always be various deviations from the average type and mean tempo of the movement. We cannot know how rapidly and how successfully the various historical movements in a given epoch will develop, but we can and do know which class stands at the hub of one epoch or another, determining its main content, the main direction of its development, the main characteristics of the historical situation in that epoch, etc. Only on that basis, i.e. by taking into account, in the first place, the fundamental distinctive features of the various epochs, and not single episodes in the history of individual countries, can we correctly evolve our tactics. Only a knowledge of the basic features of a given epoch can serve as the foundation for an understanding of the specific features of one country or another. It is to this region that both Patrusov's and Kautsky's main sophism, or their fundamental historical error, pertains. Kautsky's article was published in the same issue of Nasze Dzieło, an error which has led both of them to national liberal, not Marxist, conclusions. The trouble is that the instance chosen by Patrusov, which has presented a special interest to him, namely the instance of the Italian campaign of 1859, as well as a number of similar historical instances quoted by Kautsky, quote, in no way pertain to those historical epochs, unquote, at the juncture of which we are living. Let us call the epoch we are entering, or have entered, and which is in its initial stages, the present day, or third epoch. Let us call that which we have just emerged from the epoch of yesterday, or the second. In that case, we shall have to call the epoch from which Patrusov and Kautsky cite their instances, the day before yesterday, or first epoch. Both Patrusov's and Kautsky's revolting sophistry, the intolerable falseness of their arguments, consist in their substituting for the conditions of the present day, or third epoch, the conditions of the day before yesterday, or first epoch. I shall try to explain what I mean. The usual division into historical epochs, so often cited in Marxist literature and so many times repeated by Kautsky and adopted in Patrusov's article, is the following. First period, 1789 to 1871, the Paris Commune. The second period, 1871 to 1914, World War I. Third period, 1914 to an unknown point in the future. Here, of course, as everywhere in nature and society, the lines of division are conventional and variable, relative, not absolute. We take the most outstanding and striking historical events only approximately, as milestones in important historical movements. The first epoch from the Great French Revolution to the Franco-Prussian War is one of the rise of the bourgeoisie, of its triumph, of the bourgeoisie on the upgrade, an epoch of bourgeois democratic movements in general and of bourgeois national movements in particular, an epoch of the rapid breakdown of the obsolete feudal absolutist institutions. The second epoch is that of the full domination and decline of the bourgeoisie, one of transition from its progressive character towards reactionary and even ultra-reactionary finance capital. This is an epoch in which a new class, present-day democracy, is preparing and slowly mustering its forces. The third epoch, which has just set in, places the bourgeoisie in the same position as that in which the feudal lords found themselves during the first epoch. This is the epoch of imperialism and imperialist upheavals, as well as of upheavals stemming from the nature of imperialism. It was none other than Kautsky who, in a series of articles and in his pamphlet The Way to Power, which appeared in 1909, outlined with full clarity the basic features of the third epoch that has set in, and who noted the fundamental differences between this epoch and the second, that of yesterday, and recognized the change in the immediate tasks, as well as in the conditions and forms of struggle of present-day democracy, a change stemming from the changed objective historical conditions. Kautsky is now burning that which he worshipped yesterday. His change of front is most incredible, most unbecoming, and most shameless. In the above-mentioned pamphlet, he spoke forthrightly of symptoms of an approaching war, and specifically of the kind of war that became a fact in 1914. It would suffice simply to place side by side for comparison a number of passages from that pamphlet and from his present writings to show convincingly how Kautsky has betrayed his own convictions and solemn declarations. In this respect, Kautsky is not an individual instance, or even a German instance. He is a typical representative of the entire upper crust of present-day democracy, which, at a moment of crisis, has deserted to the side of the bourgeoisie. All the historical instances quoted by Patrusov and Kautsky belong to the first epoch. The main objective content of the historical wartime phenomena, not only of 1855, 1859, 1864, 1866, or 1870, but also of 1877, the Russo-Turkish War, and 1896 to 1897, the wars between Turkey and Greece, and the Armenian disturbances, were bourgeois national movements, or convulsions, in a bourgeois society ridding itself of every kind of feudalism. At that time, there could have been no possibility of really independent action by present-day democracy, action of the kind befitting the epoch of the overmaturity and decay of the bourgeoisie in a number of leading countries. The bourgeoisie was then the chief class, which was on the upgrade as a result of its participation in those wars. It alone could come out with overwhelming force against the feudal absolutist institutions. Represented by various strata of property producers of commodities, this bourgeoisie was progressive in various degrees in the different countries, sometimes, like part of the Italian bourgeoisie in 1859, being even revolutionary. The general feature of the epoch, however, was the progressiveness of the bourgeoisie, i.e., its unresolved and uncompleted struggle against feudalism. It was perfectly natural for the elements of present-day democracy, and for Marx as their representative, to have been guided at the time by the unquestionable principle of support for the progressive bourgeoisie, i.e., capable of waging a struggle against feudalism, and for them to be dealing with the problem as to the, quote, success of which side, i.e., of which bourgeoisie was more desirable. The popular movement in the principal countries affected by the war was generally democratic at that time, i.e., bourgeois democratic, in its economic and class content. It is quite natural that no other question could have been posed at the time except the following: the success of which bourgeoisie, the success of which combination of forces, the failure of which reactionary forces, that is, which feudal absolutist forces which were hampering the rise of the bourgeoisie, promised contemporary democracy more elbow room. As even Patrusov has had to admit, Marx was guided in his appraisal of international conflicts springing from bourgeois national and liberation movements, by considerations as to whose success was more capable of contributing to the development of national and, in general, popular democratic movements. That means that during military conflicts stemming from the bourgeoisie's rise to power within the various nationalities, Marx was, as in 1848, most of all concerned with extending the scope of the bourgeois democratic movement and bringing it to a head through the participation of broader and more plebeian masses, the petty bourgeoisie in general, the peasantry in particular, and finally of the poor classes as a whole. This concern of Marx for the extension of the movement's social base and its development is the fundamental distinction between Marx's consistently democratic tactics and Lassalle's inconsistent tactics, which veered toward an alliance with the National Liberals. The international conflicts in the Third Epoch have, in form, remained the same kind of international conflicts as those of the First Epoch, but their social and class content has changed radically. The objective historical situation has grown quite different. The place of the struggle of a rising capital, striving toward national liberation from feudalism, has been taken by the struggle waged against the new forces by the most reactionary finance capital, the struggle of a force that has exhausted and outlived itself and is heading downward toward decay. The bourgeois national state framework, which in the First Epoch was the mainstay of the development of the productive forces of a humanity that was liberating itself from feudalism, has now, in the Third Epoch, become a hindrance to the further development of the productive forces. From a rising and progressive class, the bourgeoisie has turned into a declining, decadent, and reactionary class. It is quite another class that is now on the upgrade on a broad historical scale. Patrusov and Kautsky have abandoned the standpoint of that class. They have turned back, repeating the false bourgeois assertion that today, too, the objective content of the historical process consists in the bourgeoisie's progressive movement against feudalism. In reality, there can now be no talk of present-day democracy following in the wake of the reactionary imperialist bourgeoisie, no matter of what shade the latter may be. In the First Epoch, the objective and historical task was to ascertain how, in its struggle against the chief representatives of a dying feudalism, the progressive bourgeoisie should utilize international conflicts so as to bring the greatest possible advantage to the entire democratic bourgeoisie of the world. In the first epoch, over half a century ago, it was natural and inevitable that the bourgeoisie, enslaved by feudalism, should wish the defeat of its, quote, own feudal oppressor, all the more so that the principal and central feudal strongholds of all European importance were not so numerous at the time. This is how Marx appraised the conflicts. He ascertained in which country, in a given and concrete situation, the success of the bourgeois liberation movement was more important in undermining the all-European feudal stronghold. At present, in the third epoch, no feudal fortresses of all European significance remain. Of course, it is the task of present-day democracy to utilize conflicts, but, despite Patrusov and Kautsky, this international utilization must be directed not against individual national finance capital, comment finance capital being the merger of financial and industrial capital in the advanced monopoly capitalist or imperialist period, continuing, but against international finance capital. The utilization should not be effected by a class which was on the ascendant 50 or 100 years ago. At that time, it was a question of international action, to use Patrusov's expression, by the most advanced bourgeois democracy. Today, it is another class that is confronted by a similar task created by history and advanced by the objective state of affairs. Section 3. The second epoch, or as Patrusov puts it, a span of 45 years, 1870 to 1914, is characterized very inconclusively by him. The same incompleteness is the shortcoming in Trotsky's characterization of the same period, given in his German work, although he does not agree with Patrusov's practical conclusions, this of course standing to the former's credit. Both writers hardly realize the reason for their standing so close to each other in a certain sense. Here's what Patrusov writes of this epoch, which we have called the second, that of yesterday, quote, "A detailed restriction of work and the struggle and an all-pervading gradualism. These signs of the times, which by some have been elevated to a principle, have become to others an ordinary fact in their lives, and as such have become part of their mentality, a shade of their ideology." Another quote, "Its," meaning this epoch's, "talent for a smooth and cautious advance had, as its reverse, firstly, a pronounced non-adaptability to any break in gradualness and to catastrophic phenomena of any kind, and secondly, an exceptional isolation within the sphere of national action, the national milieu." Another quote, "Neither revolution nor war." Another quote, "Democracy became the more effectively nationalist, the longer the period of its position warfare was protracted, and the longer there lingered on the stage that spell of European history, which knew of no international conflicts in the heart of Europe, and consequently experienced no unrest extending beyond the boundaries of national state territories, and felt no keen interest on a general European or world scale." Unquote. The chief shortcoming in this characterization, as in Trotsky's characterization of the same epoch, is a reluctance to discern and recognize the deep contradictions in modern democracy, which has developed on the foundation described above. The impression is produced that the democracy contemporary with the epoch under review remained a single whole, which, generally speaking, was pervaded with gradualism, turned nationalist, was by degrees weaned away from breaks in gradualness and from catastrophes, and grew petty and mildewed. In reality, this could not have happened, since, side by side with the aforesaid tendencies, other and reverse tendencies were undoubtedly operating. The day-by-day life of the working masses was undergoing an internationalization. The cities were attracting ever more inhabitants, and living conditions in the large cities of the whole world were being leveled out. Capital was becoming internationalized, and at the big factories, townsmen and country folk, both native and alien, were intermingling. The class contradictions were growing ever more acute. The employers' associations were exercising ever greater pressure on the workers' unions. Sharper and more bitter forms of struggle were arising, as for instance mass strikes. The cost of living was rising. The pressure of finance capital was becoming intolerable, etc., etc. In actual fact, events did not follow the pattern described by Patrusov. This we know definitely. In the period under discussion, none, literally not one, of the leading capitalist countries of Europe was spared by the struggle between the two mutually opposed currents within contemporary democracy. In each of the big countries, the struggle at times assumed most violent forms, including splits, this despite the general peaceful, sluggish, and somnolent character of the epoch. These contradictory currents have affected all the various fields of life and all problems of modern democracy without exception, such as the attitude toward the bourgeoisie, alliances with the liberals, the voting for war credits, the attitude towards such matters as colonial policies, reforms, the character of economic struggle, the neutrality of the trade unions, etc. All-pervading gradualism was in no way the predominant sentiment in all contemporary democracy, as the writings of Patrusov and Trotsky imply. No, this gradualism was taking shape as a definite political trend, which at the time often produced individual groups, and sometimes even individual parties, of modern democracy in Europe. That trend had its own leaders, its press organs, its policy, and its own particular, and specially organized, method of influencing the masses of the population. Moreover, this trend was more and more basing itself, and ultimately based itself solidly, on the interests of a definite social stratum within the democracy of the time. All-pervading gradualism naturally attracted into the ranks of that democracy a number of petty bourgeois fellow travelers. Furthermore, the specifically petty bourgeois conditions, and consequently a petty bourgeois political orientation, became the rule with a definite stratum of parliamentarians, journalists, and trade union officials. A kind of bureaucracy and aristocracy of the working class was arising in a manner more or less pronounced and clear-cut. Take, for instance, the possession of colonies and the expansion of colonial possessions. These were undoubted features of the period dealt with above, and with the majority of big states. What did that mean in the economic sense? It meant a sum of super profits and special privileges for the bourgeoisie. It meant, moreover, the possibility of enjoying crumbs from this big cake for a small minority of the petty bourgeois, as well as for the better-placed employees, officials of the labor movement, etc. The enjoyment of crumbs of advantage from the colonies, from privileges, by an insignificant minority of the working class in Britain, for instance, is an established fact, recognized and pointed out by Marx and Engels. Formerly confined to Britain alone, this phenomenon became common to all the great capitalist countries of Europe, as their colonial possessions expanded, and in general as the imperialist period of capitalism grew and developed. In a word, the all-pervading gradualism of the second epoch, the one of yesterday, has created not only a certain non-adaptability to any break in gradualness, as Patrusov thinks, not only certain possibilist tendencies, as Trotsky supposes, but an entire opportunist trend based on a definite social stratum within present-day democracy, and linked with the bourgeoisie of its own national shade by numerous ties of common economic, social, and political interests, a trend directly, openly, consciously, and systematically hostile to any idea of a break in gradualness. A number of Trotsky's tactical and organizational errors, to say nothing of Patrusov's, spring from his fear or his reluctance, or inability to recognize the fact of the maturity achieved by the opportunist trend, and also its intimate and unbreakable link with the national liberals, or social nationalists, of our times. In practice, this failure to recognize this maturity, or growth of the movement to an advanced stage, and this unbreakable link leads at least to absolute confusion and helplessness in the face of the predominant social nationalist or national liberal evil. The link between opportunism and social nationalism is, generally speaking, denied by Patrusov, by Martov, Axelrod, V. Kosovsky, who has talked himself into defending the German Democrats' national liberal vote for war credits, and by Trotsky. Their main, quote, argument is that no full coincidence exists between yesterday's division of democracy along the line of opportunism and today's division along the line of social nationalism. This argument is, firstly, incorrect in point of fact, as we shall presently show. Secondly, it is absolutely one-sided, incomplete, and untenable from the standpoint of Marxist principles. Persons and groups may shift from one side to the other. That is not only possible, but even inevitable in any great social upheaval. However, it does not at all affect the nature of a definite trend, or the ideological links between definite trends, or their class significance. All these considerations might seem so generally known and indisputable that one feels almost embarrassed at having to lay such emphasis on them. Yet the above-mentioned writers have lost sight of these very considerations. The fundamental class significance of opportunism, or, in other words, its social economic content, lies in certain elements of present-day democracy having gone over, in fact, though perhaps unconsciously, to the bourgeoisie on a number of individual issues. Opportunism is tantamount to a liberal labor policy. Anyone who is fearful of the, quote, factional look of these words would do well to go to the trouble of studying the opinions of Marx, Engels, and Kautsky. Is the latter not an authority highly suitable to the opponents of factionalism on, let us say, British opportunism? There cannot be the slightest doubt that such a study would lead to a recognition of the coincidence of fundamentals between opportunism and a liberal labor policy. The basic class significance of today's social nationalism is exactly the same. The fundamental idea of opportunism is an alliance or a drawing together, sometimes an agreement, bloc, or the like, between the bourgeoisie and its antipode. The fundamental idea of social nationalism is exactly the same. The ideological and political affinity, connection, and even identity between opportunism and social nationalism are beyond doubt. Naturally, we must take as our basis not individuals or groups, but a class analysis of the content of social trends, and an ideological and political examination of their essential and main principles. Approaching the same subject from a somewhat different angle, we shall ask, whence did social nationalism appear? How did it grow and mature? What gave it significance and strength? He who has been unable to find answers to these questions has completely failed to understand what social nationalism is, and is consequently quite incapable of drawing an ideological line between himself and social nationalism, no matter how vehemently he may assert that he is ready to do so. There can be only one answer to this question. Social nationalism has developed from opportunism, and it was the latter that gave it strength. How could social nationalism have appeared all of a sudden? In the same fashion as a babe appears all of a sudden, if 9 months have elapsed since its conception. Each of the numerous manifestations of opportunism during the entire second or yesterday epoch in all the European countries was a rivulet which now flowed all of a sudden into a big, though very shallow, and we might add parenthetically, muddy and dirty, river of social nationalism. 9 months after conception, the babe must separate from its mother. Many decades after opportunism was conceived, social nationalism, its ripe fruit, will have to separate from present-day democracy within a period that is more or less brief, as compared with decades. No matter how good people may scold, rage, or vociferate over such ideas and words, this is inevitable, since it follows from the entire social development of present-day democracy and from the objective conditions in the third epoch. But if division along the line of opportunism and division along the line of social nationalism do not fully coincide, does that not prove that no substantial link exists between these two facts? It does not, in the first place, just as the fact that individual bourgeois at the end of the 18th century went over either to the side of the feudal lords or that of the people does not prove that there was no link between the growth of the bourgeoisie and the Great French Revolution of 1789. Secondly, taken by and large, there is such a coincidence, and we are speaking only in a general sense and of movements as a whole. Take not one individual country, but a number of them, let's say 10 European countries, Germany, Britain, France, Belgium, Russia, Italy, Sweden, Switzerland, Holland, and Bulgaria. Only the 3 countries given in italics, Britain, France, and Belgium, may seem the exceptions. In the others, the trends of uncompromising antagonists to opportunism have given birth to trends hostile to social nationalism. Compare the well-known Monatschefte and its opponents in Germany, Nasze Dielo and its opponents in Russia, the party of Bisalati and its opponents in Italy, the adherents of Greulich and Grimm in Switzerland, Branting and Hogland in Sweden, and Trelstra, Pannekoek, and Gorder in Holland, and finally the Obstjo Dielo adherents and the Tesniaki in Bulgaria. The general coincidence between the old and the new division is a fact. As for complete coincidences, they do not occur even in the simplest of natural phenomena, any more than there is complete coincidence between the Volga before the comma joins it and the Volga below that point. Neither is there full similarity between a child and its parents. Britain only seems the exception. In reality, there were 2 main currents in Britain prior to the war, these being identified with 2 dailies, which is the truest objective indication of the mass character of these currents, namely the Daily Citizen, the Opportunists' newspaper, the organ of the opportunist bloc of the Labour Party, Fabians, and the Independent Labour Party of Britain, and the Daily Herald, the organ of the opponents of opportunism, the British Socialist Party. Both papers have been swamped by the wave of nationalism, yet opposition has been expressed by under 1/10 of the former's adherents and by some 3/7 of the adherents of the latter. The usual method of comparison, whereby only the British Socialist Party is compared with the Independent Labour Party, is erroneous, because it overlooks the existence of an actual bloc of the latter with the Fabians and the Labour Party. Footnote here about the Fabians: these were members of the Fabian Society, a British reformist organization founded in 1884. The name is an allusion to the Roman commander Quintus Fabius Maximus, who was called the Delayer for his tactics of harassing Hannibal's army without risking a pitched battle. Most of the society's members were bourgeois intellectuals, scholars, writers, politicians, such as Sidney and Beatrice Webb, Bernard Shaw, Ramsay MacDonald, who denied the need for the class struggle of the proletariat in a socialist revolution, and insisted that the transition from capitalism to socialism lay only through petty reform and a gradual transformation of society. Lenin said it was a, quote, extremely opportunist trend. The Fabian Society, which was affiliated to the Labour Party in 1900, is one of the ideological sources of Labour Party policy. During World War I, the Fabians took a social chauvinist stand, that is, fighting for, quote, one's own bourgeoisie. For Lenin's description of the Fabians, see British pacifism and the British dislike of theory. Back to the main text. It follows then that only 2 out of the 10 countries are exceptions, but even here the exceptions are not complete, since the trends have not changed places. Only, for reasons so obvious that they need not be dwelt on, the wave has swamped almost all the opponents of opportunism. This undoubtedly proves the strength of the wave, but it does not in any way disprove coincidence between the old division and the new for all Europe. We are told that division along the line of opportunism is outmoded, and that only one division is of significance, namely, that between the adherents of internationalism and the adherents of national self-sufficiency. This opinion is fundamentally wrong. The concept of adherents of internationalism is devoid of all content and meaning if we do not concretely amplify it. Any step toward such concrete amplification, however, will be an enumeration of features of hostility to opportunism. In practice, this will prove truer still. An adherent of internationalism who is not at the same time a most consistent and determined adversary of opportunism is a phantom, nothing more. Perhaps certain individuals of this type will honestly consider themselves internationalists. However, people are judged not by what they think of themselves, but by their political behavior. The political behavior of so-called internationalists who are not consistent and determined adversaries of opportunism will always aid and abet the nationalist trend. On the other hand, nationalists too call themselves internationalists. For example, Kautsky, Lynch, Hainisch, van der Velde, Hindman, and others. Not only do they call themselves so, but they fully acknowledge an international rapprochement, an agreement, a union of persons sharing their views. The opportunists are not against internationalism, they are only in favor of international approval for and international agreement among the opportunists. And that is the end of the audiobook. So this piece is not what I would call one of the better known pieces by Lenin, but it does hit on a number of important topics. First and foremost, the interconnected topics of social nationalism, social chauvinism, opportunism, and the historical decline in the bourgeoisie's progressiveness. Then also are discussed some of the other quote-unquote Marxists who have failed to understand that, including Trotsky, as Lenin discusses here at some length. In particular, now that the IMT, or International Marxist Tendency, is sort of rebranding itself by launching the Revolutionary Communists of America, we get a lot of people trying to promote that in the comments and people asking, hey, what's your problem with Trotskyism? Trotsky sucked. And although Trotskyists try to portray themselves as the real adherents of Lenin, calling themselves Bolshevik Leninists and various other things, this is a Marxist-Leninist channel. Trotskyism and Marxism-Leninism are at odds with each other, and that's not just a thing that I invented. That's been the case for a very long time. We'll do more on that topic in the future, but I mean, this is just one example, and not even a particularly detailed one, of where Lenin is dissecting Trotsky's writings for the various significant errors that they tended to contain. We have one thing on the channel already. If you search on Lenin on Trotsky, you'll find it, and like I said, we'll be adding more to that in the future. But anyway, the main thing here about opportunism, social chauvinism, and the sort of attachment of would-be proletarian Marxist movements to the bourgeoisie. This has been a significant problem, and one that I think that Marxists can expect to keep combating time and time again until the final victory of socialism. We have covered it in the anti-Browderism playlist. That was the CPUSA in the 1940s, becoming massively opportunist, and that continues to be a problem to this day. Then there's the developing conflict between the NATO bloc and the BRICS bloc, which we mentioned in the comments. A lot of people trying to do lesser evilism on that one. That is not a Marxist-Leninist position, but there's a lot of keyboard warriors out there who think that it's too hard to build and maintain proletarian organizations with an independent class perspective, which are able not only to analyze the world, but also to effect change within it. So instead, they just start glomming onto one trend that they see in the media or another, basically whichever imperialist bloc is doing the best PR. They just start reading the publicity supporting those imperialists. And really all it does is it prevents those people from doing anything meaningful for their class. And that just becomes like this cheerleading session for one side or the other, which they've deemed to be the lesser evil. And on it goes. But Lenin addressed this over 100 years ago. So if you see people getting this wrong today, it's really just because they have not taken the time to study, and the people who are guiding them are not guided by Marxist-Leninist principles. So yeah, you might feel like buying into that stuff is accomplishing something for you in the here and now. It really isn't. All it's really doing is delaying the completion of the tasks that lie before us in this moment, which again, a lot of people are just saying are too hard. But again, aligning with one bourgeoisie or the other, trying to do this, 4D chess geopolitics thing, I know it makes you feel like you are accomplishing something, but you're not in control. Actually, I had a commenter just recently saying, shouldn't we be dividing the bourgeoisie? That's just not really how it works. There are divisions that emerge between different imperialist interests, but that's for redivision of the profits of the world imperialist system. That's not something that we, the proletariat, are doing. So this is not only a misunderstanding in the strategic sphere, it's a confusion of interests, it's a misunderstanding of power dynamics, really just a lot of confusion. But again, I think that the social chauvinism, which again opens the door to something like fascism as well, is something that needs to be understood. And when you see this out there, you see some group that is claiming to be Marxist, upholding these kinds of views, call it what it is, combat it, let others know that this is not something to be spread and followed. All right, we're going to leave it there. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below, and we will continue the discussion as always in the comments section. In the meantime, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. This channel is solely viewer supported. We don't do ads or sponsorships, so those contributions are hugely helpful, encouraging, and important. If you like this channel, find it helpful, learn something from it, thank me, of course, but also thank a patron or Buy Me a Coffee supporter, and consider becoming one yourself. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe. And finally, remember that you can do a lot of agitating and educating online, but in the end, the organizing happens in real life. Network with your local left, see if there are organizations that you can join, and take what you've learned here into the class struggle where you live. All right, thanks again, and we will see you in the next video.